Have you ever wondered how a single bullet could trigger a global conflict that would redefine the world as we know it? Our story begins on a warm summer day in Sarajevo, on June the 28th, 1914. Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria, next in line to the Habsburg throne, was visiting the city with his wife Sophie. As they paraded through the streets, a young Bosnian Serb nationalist, Gavrilo Princip, stepped forward and fired 2 shots. These bullets would not just end the lives of the Archduke and his wife, but also set in motion a chain of events that would lead to the outbreak of the First World War. The political climate at the time was a veritable powder keg. Nationalism was on the rise, with various ethnic groups demanding autonomy and independence. The Balkans, in particular, was a hotbed of such tensions, with Serbia seeking to expand its influence over the Slavic peoples of Austria-Hungary. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand was a direct challenge to Austrian authority, and it was this act that would ignite the fuse. In the aftermath of the murder, Austria-Hungary, backed by Germany, issued an ultimatum to Serbia. It was an ultimatum so severe that it was almost certain to be rejected. And when Serbia did reject it, Austria-Hungary declared war. This declaration of war set off a domino effect. Allies of Serbia, including Russia, France, and later Britain, were pulled into the conflict. On the other side, the Central Powers, consisting of Germany, Austria-Hungary and their allies, mobilized their forces. The world was polarized and countries were forced to choose sides. The stage was set for a conflict on a scale that the world had never seen before. This was not just a war of soldiers and weapons. It was a war of ideologies, alliances and empires. It was a war that would change the geopolitical landscape forever. It was a war that would lead to the loss of millions of lives. The spark had been lit and the world was on a course for war. In a world divided, which nations would rise to the call of conflict? As the storm clouds of war darkened the skies of Europe in the early 20th century, 2 major alliances took shape: the Allies and the Central Powers. The Allies, a coalition bound by mutual defence agreements, were initially composed of the United Kingdom, France, and Russia. The United Kingdom and France, as colonial powers with vast empires, had a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. Russia, on the other hand, saw an opportunity to expand its influence and protect its Slavic brethren in the Balkans. The Central Powers, meanwhile, were formed around the dual alliance of Germany and Austria-Hungary, later joined by the Ottoman Empire. Germany, a young and ambitious nation, sought to challenge the existing power structure and expand its own empire. Austria-Hungary, a multi-ethnic empire on the brink of collapse, hoped to reassert its dominance in the region. The Ottoman Empire, often referred to as the sick man of Europe, saw the alliance as a lifeline to stave off further decline. These alliances were not merely geographical or political constructs. They represented a complex web of interests, fears, ambitions, and rivalries. They were shaped by a potent mix of nationalism, imperial ambition, and a growing arms race. They reflected a world where the balance of power was shifting, where old empires were fading, and where new nations were eager to claim their place on the global stage. It's worth noting that these alliances were not fixed. Over the course of the war, nations would switch sides, others would join the fray, and some would seek to remain neutral. Italy, for instance, initially aligned with the Central Powers, but later switched sides to join the Allies. Lines were drawn, alliances formed, and the stage was set for a conflict on a scale the world had never seen before. This was a war that would redefine the map of Europe, a war that would unleash unprecedented devastation, a war that would forever alter the course of human history. But at its core, it was a war between 2 alliances, each convinced of its cause, and each determined to emerge victorious. Can you imagine living in a muddy trench under constant threat of enemy fire? In the third act of our journey through World War I, we delve into the harsh and grueling reality of life in the trenches. Picture this: a labyrinth of muddy trenches stretching as far as the eye can see. These trenches were not just temporary shelters, but homes to soldiers for months, sometimes even years at a time. Each day, the soldiers would wake up to the sound of artillery fire, their hearts pounding in their chests, not knowing whether they would live to see another day. life in the trenches was far from comfortable. The damp, cold conditions, coupled with the lack of proper sanitation, led to numerous health issues. Soldiers battled not just the enemy, but also diseases like trench foot and dysentery. Food was scarce, and what little they had was often infested with weevils or worse. But the physical discomfort was just one part of the ordeal. The mental toll was equally, if not more, devastating. Imagine being confined in a small, muddy space for months on end, with the constant fear of death looming over you. The sound of a shell exploding nearby could mean the end, and the monotony of waiting, the uncertainty of survival, wore down even the toughest of spirits. Letters from soldiers often spoke of this psychological strain. They wrote about the longing for home, the despair, and the sheer exhaustion of living in a state of constant alertness. Yet, amidst all this, there were also stories of camaraderie and resilience. Soldiers found comfort in shared experiences, in the moments of laughter and camaraderie amidst the chaos. World War I was a conflict of unprecedented scale and devastation, and nowhere was this more evident than in the trenches. The trenches were a testament to human resilience in the face of unimaginable hardship. They were a harsh reminder of the grim reality of war, a reality that often gets lost in the grand narratives of victory and defeat. In the trenches, the true horror of war was laid bare. Did you know that World War I was not just fought on land, but also at sea and in the air? The Great War was indeed a comprehensive theatre of conflict, extending to the vast oceans and the expansive skies above. The naval and aerial aspects of World War I played pivotal roles in shaping the course of the war. Let's voyage into the deep waters first. The advent of U-boats, or submarines as we know them today, revolutionized naval warfare. Germany in particular made extensive use of these stealthy predators of the sea. The unrestricted submarine warfare campaign launched by the Germans was a key factor that eventually led to the United States joining the war on the side of the Allies. One of the most significant naval battles of the war was the Battle of Jutland. This colossal clash between the British Royal Navy's Grand Fleet and the Imperial German Navy's High Seas Fleet saw over 200 ships and more than 100,000 men engaged in a grueling day-long battle. Now let's ascend from the depths of the sea and soar into the skies. The war in the air was a new frontier, with aviation technology still in its infancy. Nevertheless, both sides were eager to exploit this novel platform for strategic advantage. Zeppelins, these enormous airships, were initially used by the Germans for reconnaissance. However, they soon found a more sinister use: bombing raids. The sight of these behemoths looming in the sky became a symbol of terror for those on the ground. But the skies were not left uncontested. The emergence of fighter planes led to daring dogfights high above the trenches. Pilots like the infamous Red Baron became legends, their names synonymous with the deadly ballet that was aerial combat. The war was not confined to the trenches, it raged across the seas and skies as well. The impact of this broader theatre of war was profound, forever changing the way nations would engage in conflict on land, at sea, and in the air. How does a war that consumed the world finally come to an end? This is a question that echoes through the annals of history, and the answer is as complex as the conflict itself. The end of World War I was a domino effect of momentous events that began with the entry of the United States into the war in April of 1917. The infusion of fresh troops and resources tipped the scales in favour of the Allies, providing a much-needed boost to their war effort. Meanwhile, the Russian Revolution of 1917 was a game-changer on the Eastern Front. The Bolsheviks, having seized power, promptly pulled Russia out of the war to focus on internal upheaval. This allowed Germany to divert more forces to the Western Front, but it was a case of too little, too late. As the year 1918 unfolded, the Central Powers found themselves increasingly beleaguered. The final straw came with the signing of the armistice on the 11th of November 1918. An eerie silence fell over the battlefields of Europe as the guns fell silent, marking the end of the Great War. But the end of the war was not the end of the story. The peace was brokered in the grand halls of Versailles, where the victors carved up the world map without much regard for the people living on it. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June of 1919, imposed heavy penalties on Germany, sowing the seeds of resentment that would eventually bloom into another, even more devastating war. In the aftermath of World War I, empires crumbled, new nations were born, and societies were forever changed. Women, having stepped into roles previously held by men, began to demand equal rights. The map of the world was redrawn, and the stage was set for the rest of the 20th century. World War I left a lasting impact on the world, reshaping borders, societies, and the course of history itself.